you very much, Shane. Great to be here. As Keith Richards says, great to be here, great to be anywhere. I'm delighted to be talking to you about chocolate today because it's one of my favorite subjects. It's also how I earn a living. So that's a nice place to be. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to spend some time just looking at where cocoa comes from and how chocolate is made. And then we're going to be doing a tasting, which involves trying 5 different chocolate bars from 5 different countries. And we'll be running through how to do a tasting of chocolate before we actually start on the bars. And then we'll be using those techniques to see if we can determine some differences in flavor coming from the different origins of cocoa beans. So that's the plan. I think that might take us about half an hour. So there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. If there's anything you want to ask me about chocolate, or if there's anything that you've always wondered about chocolate and you wanted to find out, or anything that I've said sparks in you an idea. So hopefully plenty of time at the end for questions. So please feel free. Now, Shane.
Very, very naughty on my part. I didn't tell people how to ask those questions.
Ah, yes, good.
I'm assuming everyone knows how to use the tech. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a little button there that says Q&A. If you type your question into the Q&A box, that will come onto my screen, and then I will then ask your question to Simon for you. So these Zoom webinars work very slightly differently to Zoom. Most of us have been living our lives on Zoom the last few months. Zoom webinars work very, very slightly differently. We can't actually see you, and we can't actually hear you, though you can see Simon and that's how to ask your question. Sorry, Simon.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Shane. That's very helpful. So the really exciting bit comes now when I try and share my screen. So let's see how we get on. Great. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to introduce myself. Then we're going to talk about what chocolate is in legal terms. Then where does cocoa grow? How does cocoa grow? How do you make chocolate? And then a little bit about terroir and taste. Then we're going to do a how to taste chocolate. And finally, we're going to have our tasting session, 5 chocolates from 5 countries. If you haven't gone out and bought the 5 Sainsbury's bars I recommended, please do stay with us, stay on the session, because you can always go and pick up the bars and then watch the session again at a later date. So don't worry if you haven't got the 5 chocolate bars, but obviously it's going to be more fun if you have. So this is me. I started my life in confectionery. My very first job was trying to make a better mint imperial. And since then I've worked for Nestle, United Biscuits, Lion's Made as was, and GB Glass, who are the Swedish version of Unilever, making ice cream. I was in at the beginning of Green and Blacks, and I helped to develop the initial Green and Blacks range, and then did the same thing for Divine Chocolate. I've been working with an Italian chocolate manufacturer called Ecam for the last 10 years. And Ecam specializes in making bars for supermarkets under their own label. So not so much a brand like Mars or Nestle, appearing under labels like Sainsbury's Taste the Difference. So that's what we specialize in. I'm a bit of a cocoa head. So I'm a committee member of the Academy of Chocolate, which exists to promote fine chocolate. And I'm a current member of the Fair Trade Foundation Board and also of the Soil Association Standards Board, because I'm very interested in sustainability, and sustainability is very important to cocoa. So what is chocolate? Well, at the moment, and I say at the moment because this may all change at the end of the year when we leave the EU, but all the time we're working with EU legislation, this is the definition of chocolate that we work to. So you'll see that dark chocolate is defined as a mixture of cocoa and sugar. There must be some cocoa there, there must be some sugar there. So you'll begin to see on shelf now bars that are 100% cocoa. Technically, they're not chocolate. If they were 99% cocoa and 1% sugar, they would be chocolate. So You know, that's the legal definition of dark chocolate, and it gives you the minimum cocoa solids that you need to have there. Milk chocolate is also defined in law. So in addition to sugar and cocoa, you have a minimum milk content. Contrary to popular opinion, white chocolate really is chocolate because it contains cocoa butter, which is a cocoa. Therefore, it's cocoa and sugar, so it's chocolate. There's a technical definition for a fourth type of chocolate, which is gianduja, very popular in Italy, which is where you blend hazelnut paste in with chocolate. And this is becoming increasingly popular over here. And then finally, chocolate couverture has its own definition. If you ever see terms on a product label of chocolate flavored coating or chocolate compound, that is not chocolate. Usually what's happened is some of the cocoa butter has been replaced by vegetable fat, sometimes for reasons of cost, sometimes because it's a functional thing, for example, the coating on a choc ice. And also cooking chocolate is a slightly different category because it's not liable for VAT. So that's why cooking chocolate sometimes seems a little more reasonably priced than chocolate you see in the chocolate aisle. So those are the legal definitions of what chocolate is. Now, where does cocoa come from? Well, cocoa trees go best in a band that runs around the equator, and they grow within 15 to 20 degrees north or south of that equator. So that means for the foreseeable future, and unless global warming gets a lot worse, we will not be seeing cocoa grown in Europe anytime soon. So we're talking about West Africa, Central South America, and parts of Asia. If you look to the right of the map, it gives you the percentage share of the market from cocoas from different countries. And you'll see that the Ivory Coast and Ghana, between them, account for about 60% of the world's cocoa. So that is really important. If there are any problems with the crop in those countries, it affects the rest of the cocoa world. Now, the cocoa that my company tends to use doesn't tend to come from those countries so much. We tend to source from places like Peru, Ecuador, Madagascar, Dominican Republic, Sao Tome, the sort of countries whose origins we're going to be looking at today. Now, the cocoa from those countries is referred to as fine cocoa. This is basically cocoa where the characteristics of the country translate into the cocoa. So, for example, cocoa from Peru is thought to have a particular flavor to do with red berries. So that would be described as a fine cocoa. And about 4% of the world's cocoa is classified as fine. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the other 96% cocoa in the world, but it doesn't have such characteristic or distinctive flavors. There are three bean types: Forastero, Criollo, and Trinitario. If you think of it as analogous to coffee, then Forastero is the Robusta, Criollo is the Arabica, Trinitario is a blend of the two. There will be people who will tell you that only Criollo beans make great chocolate. In my experience, you can make great chocolate from any of those three bean types. As people become more interested in buying chocolate and locating that chocolate with its origin, some of the smaller origins are coming into play. An example here is Vietnam. There's some very good chocolate being made with cocoa from Vietnam, and we will see more and more of these smaller origins coming onto the market. Oops. Cocoa grows in small family farms, typically 2 to 5 hectares. Only 5% of cocoa comes from large plantations. So this is basically a very labor-intensive, hands-on crop grown by small farmers. It's a shade crop. So it's often grown by farmers with another crop to give it shade, like bananas. And of course, that provides another source of income for the farmer. It's cultivated by hand. Very little about cocoa production is mechanized. So the way it works is when the cocoa pods or cabasas reach maturity, and you see a bewildering number of colors of cabasas, When they come to maturity, they're cut down with a machete, an incredibly sharp knife. You then cut the cabasa into two very carefully to avoid spoiling the beans. So it's a very, very hands-on and very labor-intensive thing to do to be a cocoa farmer. Ideal altitude 400 meters, ideal temperature is 20 to 30 degrees centigrade. As an aside, global warming means that the areas where we grow cocoa are changing. Some areas are just getting too hot. If you're lucky, you could get maybe 80 pods per year out of a tree, and a tree could take 8 years to reach maturity. So these things don't happen in a hurry. So I was saying, you harvest the cocoa pods carefully. In the bottom left, you'll see a pod that's been cut open. The beans are in the middle, the white, and surround them is a pulp, sort of mucilaginous pulp. And various things happen to this pulp. In some parts of the world, they actually ferment it and turn it into wine. Nestle have just got a patent on actually fermenting the pulp and turning it into sugar. So then the whole of the cocoa bean will be used in the manufacture of chocolate, which is a very clever idea. The next thing you have to do once you've harvested your beans is you need to ferment them. Fermentation is incredibly important in chocolate, just like it is in bread or wine or cheese. So when you ferment the beans, you basically take them and put them into mounds and leave them for several days. And all sorts of biochemical reactions happen in that mound. It gets very hot, and the yeasts and the molds that are naturally present on the beans begin their work of helping carbohydrates metabolize into simpler carbohydrates. The precursors to cocoa flavor begin to develop. If you didn't do that fermentation, you would end up with something that didn't taste like chocolate. So it's absolutely key to ferment the beans. One thing that happens during the fermentation is acidity develops, and getting the right amount of acidity is absolutely key. And it's a real skilled process to determine how long the fermentation should go for and when you should stop it. We stop the fermentation by drying the beans. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see how the beans are being spread out to dry in the sun. This stops the fermentation. It also reduces the moisture content of the beans to the point where they're stable and they can be transported to Europe to turn them into chocolate. So number 5 is somebody looking at a load of beans that have just arrived. They've been cut in half, and someone's going through them to make sure the beans look good. So they've got to be not too big, not too small, no sign of infestation, no sign of mold, right sort of color. All these factors are important in making sure that the beans are of sufficiently good quality to use. Once we've done that, we then start the process of turning the beans into chocolate. And the first thing to do is to roast the beans so that we can remove the outer shell. So that's done with a lot of heat very quickly. And then the shells are blown off, called winnowing, and the shells are collected and they are fed to the local pigs. Once we've got our roast cocoa beans, we then need to grind them into a paste. And this paste is called cocoa liquor, also sometimes referred to as cocoa mass. And it is 100% pure cocoa, nothing added, nothing taken away. And that is the basis of all chocolate manufacture, cocoa liquor. From cocoa liquor, we can then produce something called cocoa butter. And basically what you do is you put the liquor into a press, a physical press, and put it under a lot of pressure, and out comes the cocoa butter as a liquid. So that's the fatty part of the cocoa, but it doesn't have much flavor because the flavor stays behind in the brown bit of the cocoa, which we then turn into cocoa powder. So the way to think about it is beans turn into cocoa liquor turns into cocoa butter and cocoa powder. With cocoa liquor, cocoa butter and cocoa powder, we've got the building blocks we need to make our chocolate. So we put together our chocolate recipe, cocoa liquor, cocoa butter, maybe a bit of cocoa powder, some sugar. If we're making a dairy product, we're making milk chocolate, now's the time to add the milk powder. And we put it into something called a conch, which is a big metal tank with a stirrer. We keep the chocolate warm, so it's liquid, and we stir it. And all sorts of things happen there. Some undesirable flavors are driven off, some desirable flavors are created, and the action of the different particles, particularly the sugar crystals running over one another, reduces the particle size of the chocolate, and it gets nice and smooth, because nobody wants a gritty chocolate. Once we've got a nice smooth chocolate and we're still at liquid stage, the penultimate step is to temper the chocolate. Cocoa butter is the most extraordinarily clever fat. It exists in a lot of different crystalline forms. This is called polymorphism, but there's only one form of cocoa butter fat which is stable, and that is called beta prime. And what we do to get beta prime crystals is we heat the chocolate, which makes all the crystals melt. Then we cool it, which gives us beta prime crystals plus some others. Then we warm it up very, very slightly. That gets rid of everything other than the beta prime. It's only by having beta prime fat crystals that we will have a stable chocolate bar. So it has to be done. Otherwise, when the bar sets, it'll develop a very unattractive grey colour and not taste great. The same sort of thing that happens if you've ever been unfortunate enough to leave a bar on a radiator or in the sun, let it melt, and then it sets again. The greyness that results and the unpleasant texture, that's called bloom. And that happens when a chocolate is not tempered properly, when it doesn't have its crystals in the beta prime form. So that's a very important part of chocolate manufacture. Even after we've tempered the chocolate, it's still liquid, so we can fill it into molds. We then vibrate them a bit to get all the air out, put them through a cooling tunnel, which causes the chocolate to set. The setting point of chocolate is 37 degrees centigrade, exactly the same as the human body. And that's why, one of the reasons why chocolate's so nice to eat, because cocoa butter melts in the mouth at exactly the right temperature. So we put our chocolate down the cooling tunnel, that causes it to set, and then we can wrap it, put it into boxes, stick it on the back of a truck and bring it over to the United Kingdom. So that is how we make chocolate. And that process, because we start with the actual cocoa beans and we go all the way through to the finished bar, that process is called bean to bar. And you will see on a lot of smaller artisan manufacturers that they're very proud of being bean to bar manufacturers. Well, we're bean to bar manufacturers as well, but just on rather a larger scale. So a word about terroir. So terroir is a French word often used to describe wine. You could think of it as a sense of place. And what that means is that where the cocoa grows will determine the taste of the finished chocolate. So factors like what sort of soil it grows in, how much rain it gets, how much sun it gets, even things like what altitude it grows at, they will all have an influence on the quality of the cocoa and the taste of the finished chocolate that comes from that cocoa. And an interesting example is in the Dominican Republic, we were buying cocoa from 2 plots which were absolutely identical in all respects, except one was at sea level and one was at altitude. And you could taste the difference in the chocolate that it produced. So terroir is very important in determining what sort of chocolate you're going to end up with. And I hope we'll be able to demonstrate that when we do our tasting. And an example of it, as I mentioned earlier, in Peru, the cocoa that comes out of Peru is characterized by fresh fruit flavors, especially red fruits and honey. So we'll be watching out for that when we try our 55% Peruvian milk in just a minute. How do we taste chocolate? Well, there's more to tasting chocolate than just stick it in your mouth. So the first thing to do with chocolate is to look at it. When you take it out of the wrapper, look very carefully at the surface. Is it nice and shiny? Dark chocolate will always be shinier than milk chocolate because the cocoa butter crystals produce a better gloss than anything with dairy butterfat in it. So dark will always be shinier than milk, but there should be no bloom, none of this grey or matte appearance. You should have a nice uniform appearance. When you touch it, it should not be greasy to the touch. Chocolate will obviously melt if you keep holding it because you are the same temperature as the melting point of cocoa butter. But when you just put your finger on the bar, it shouldn't be greasy. So long as it's got a decent amount of cocoa solids in it, you should get a decent sound when you snap it. So you should be able to hear it break. Again, this is more noticeable on dark chocolate than it is on milk. Mouthfeel. It should be nice and smooth. The human mouth detects particles around the 30 micron level on average. So when we refine our chocolate, we aim to get the particle size below 30 microns. In America, as in so many things, they do things slightly differently. So chocolate like Hershey, we perceive as gritty because American chocolate is by and large not refined to the same level as European chocolate. When we get the chocolate into our mouth and let it melt, you'll start to see some flavor coming through. Now, a really good chocolate may well deliver more than one flavor. You may get an initial flavor, then a subsequent flavor and an aftertaste. And if you're getting that succession of flavors, that's a sign of a good chocolate. The tasting wheel on the right groups together some of the flavors commonly encountered in chocolate. And in the middle, we've grouped them together into the major categories. Some of them may sound a little fanciful, but I really have tasted chocolate that tasted of tobacco. So some of the more outre terms still apply. Finally, your chocolate should have an aftertaste. It should linger in the mouth and it should leave you with a nice, pleasant aftertaste that makes you want to have some more. So that's how a good chocolate should behave. I recommend that when you're tasting chocolate, it's just best to taste water in between the samples, as tea, coffee, wine, or any of the other wonderful things that go with chocolate will affect your perception of them. So that is how we taste chocolate. So we're now moving on to the actual tasting. You'll notice that the bars we're looking at today are quite thin. So the profile of the bar is quite narrow, quite slim. That is done absolutely deliberately because slimmer bar profiles let the flavor out more easily. So that's one of the reasons that they're packed in cardboard, because if they were just packed in paper, they'd be too fragile and they'd break. So the slim bars always come in cardboard outers. So the first bar we're going to taste is 34% cocoa solids, and you will see we're starting off low and we're going high. So we're starting off at the 34% and working upwards. So the bar we're going to try first, the Sainsbury's 34%, is made with cocoa from Ecuador. And what I'd like you to do when you try this bar, I'd like you to put a little bit in your mouth and just let it melt, and then see what flavors come through. Do not assume that the major flavor will be cocoa, because you may perceive other flavors which are stronger. Hopefully cocoa will be in there somewhere, but it may not be the most predominant flavor. So I'm going to open up my pack now. Taking out my first square and showing considerable restraint. I'm just going to break a little bit off, and I'm going to let it melt in my mouth. Going back to our tasting list, if you look at the chocolate and just rotate it in the light, you see there is some gloss there, particularly in the cabasa design in the middle of the mold. So that's a good omen. And if you break it, slight snap. As I said, butterfat will reduce the amount of snap that's there. Is there an aroma? Again, there is an aroma. That's good. Now, in terms of flavor, there's a lot of sweetness there. It's a milk chocolate. There's cocoa there. But I would suggest that actually for me, the major flavor I'm getting is caramel. So caramel, toffee notes. This is because in the UK, we make our chocolate slightly differently to the rest of the world. We use a process called the crumb process. And what you do is you take milk, sugar, and a little bit of cocoa, cook it all up together, and then dry it, and it makes a powder called crumb. Now, during the cooking process, you create something called Maillard reactions, which is where proteins and sugars react together. And it's the Maillard reaction that makes toffee taste of toffee, that comes into play when you make caramels. So that lovely toffee note, it's a reaction to the milk protein, the sugar being cooked up together. So it means that in the UK, things like Cadbury's Dairy Milk and Galaxy taste strongly of toffee as well as cocoa. And it means that because those are the chocolates that most of us grew up on, we are naturally predisposed to look for those sort of caramel notes. So as a result, a milk chocolate, you will never get quite such distinctive flavor as you will in the darks, because the dairy element is very important there. So that was our Ecuador 34%. I'm going to move on now to our Peruvian dark milk, which is 55% cocoa solids. 55%, and it's still a milk. This is an example of a relatively new category of bars called dark milks. So they have a lot of cocoa in them, but they have some dairy as well, which means you've got a nice balance between the cocoa notes softened by the dairy components. So here's what our bar should look like. If we go back to our how to taste chocolate slide, are we going to get a snap out of this? Yes, because of the extra cocoa, we're getting a snap. Have we got a gloss on it? Yes, we have. And better than the other milk, there's more cocoa there. Dry to the touch, no greasiness. Aroma. Oh, yes, cocoa coming through quite strongly there. Now, what does it feel like in our mouths? Are we still going to get that predominance of sweet caramel notes, or is the cocoa going to come through more strongly? Let's see. So here, I think the Maillard type reaction notes, the toffee notes, are being held in check by the cocoa. So what I'm getting is I'm getting a fruity cocoa flavor. You'll remember I said earlier that one of the characteristics of cocoa from Peru is that red berry, that fruity flavor, and I'm certainly getting that with a bit of acidity. And then getting some dairy richness after that. And I'm getting a nice long finish. So it's persisting in the mouth and leaving a nice rich aftertaste. A lot of people in the industry think that these dark milks are going to be a category that grows and grows as people get more and more interested in higher cocoa solids products. We've seen higher cocoa solids in dark chocolate. It's now beginning to emerge in milk as well. So next up is the first of our pure dark chocolates, and this is going to be a 70% dark chocolate from Venezuela. Now, 70% used to be seen as sort of like the upper limit of cocoa solids. Now, for a lot of people, it's their entry point. So a lot of people now won't look at a chocolate at below 70% solids because they've got used to the reduced sweetness and the higher cocoa impact that you get from having a good high cocoa solids chocolate. So we look at the appearance. Yes, we got a good gloss going on there. Touch it, nice and smooth, not greasy. Is there a snap? Oh yes, nice snap. Aroma? Yep, getting a good cocoa aroma there. Just pop some in the mouth, let it melt, see what the mouth feels like. So for me, that's a very well-balanced chocolate. There is some bitterness, not too much. There's some acidity, not too much. Quite a rich taste, quite approachable. And it leaves a nice clean aftertaste in the mouth. So I think if someone was interested in dark chocolate and didn't know where to start, I might point them in that direction, because I think that as a 70% chocolate, that's a really good all-round dark chocolate. Let's move on to chocolate number 4. Here the cocoa comes from Madagascar. We've gone up 10% cocoa solids, so we've gone down in sugar. So we should anticipate a less sweet product with a higher level of cocoa solids, more cocoa notes. Let's see if that's what we get. So how are we doing? Yeah, another good gloss, dry to the touch. Really quite a pronounced snap now as our cocoa solids are coming up. And a delicious aroma, very aromatic. Pop a little in my mouth, let it melt. So here we've got something with really some quite pronounced acidity. I'm getting quite a lot of nice but noticeable acidity there, which acts as a good balance to some of the other cocoa flavors that are going on. I would say this is the first one of the chocolates we've tried which has tended to dry out my mouth, and that is a tendency of high cocoa solids chocolates. They're quite astringent and they do tend to dry out the mouth. So that's just something you notice with higher cocoa solids chocolates. And then the final chocolate of our 5 today is a 90% from Uganda. So we are at the top, we're getting towards the top end of what it's possible to do now. I mentioned earlier, you can do 100% cocoa, but then you're not really in the chocolate world. So 90% is about as far as most people go. Check the snap. Oh yes, and a good gloss as well. And a lovely smell. Have a look at our list. Now for me, that's quite a surprising chocolate. For 90%, I find it very approachable, find it very easy to eat. I would describe them, the mouthfeel as almost creamy in the way that the cocoa butter melts, but it is intense, a little bit smoky. There's a lot going on in the mouth, and then quite a strong aftertaste that takes a while to dissipate. So I've got a lot of good, strong coconuts in my mouth. But I think for a 90% product, that is still very approachable. So I think that's a really good product for people who perhaps are interested in moving up a bit in cocoa solids. If they've been used to 70%, trying the 90% is definitely a good thing to do. And what we find interesting is that when we do a range of bars for a customer, the 70% dark always sells the most, but the 85s and the 90% are doing very well. They're catching up fast. So those tend to be the best sellers in a range such as this. So 5 bars, 5 different origins of cocoa beans, and I think you will agree, 5 very different flavors. So that's been my tasting today. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to know more, there is a very good video. I can't show it now because the quality doesn't come through very well, but that's the link. Or if you just put the road to chocolate into YouTube, it will come up. And it just gives you a little more information about some of the things we've been talking about today. And it also shows you the cocoa growing, and you can see all the different colors of the cocoa pods. You see the guys cutting down the cocoa pods and opening them up. And you'll also see in the factory some of the processes I've talked about actually working. It's about a 6-minute video, but it is well worth watching. So it's called The Road to Chocolate. And if you put The Road to Chocolate into YouTube, it will come up. Now, I'm going to stop sharing at this point.
While you do that, Simon, I'm going to give you a couple of questions. And then whilst you're answering those, if anyone else has any questions to come in. First of all, it was just really, really fascinating to take both different countries and get those kind of flavors coming through from the terroir, but also to literally feel how the snap was changing in our fingers.
Absolutely.
Even if you know that this happens, but actually to do it in a parallel tasting where it's 30 seconds, it's really, really pronounced.
It's in our house. It's not often that people sit down with 5 different bars of chocolate and work their way through them. So it's a slightly artificial situation, but it does indicate the differences that exist.
It was absolutely fantastic. Well, we've got a question here from someone called Holly Wright, and she's asking, is there a reason these bars are not listed as fair trade? And then I'm going to ask a question, and that's why do you think we are eating bars with higher amounts of cocoa percentage? You said it's really interesting. I remember my childhood, and everyone was eating really, really kind of sweet. It's almost really sugary now. Like we said, we're eating, darker and darker chocolate. I just wondered if you had a sense of why that may be. What were the first 2 questions?
Okay, great. These bars are not fair trade. They are using cocoa that's been sourced from the Rainforest Alliance. So fair trade very much focuses on farmer income. Rainforest Alliance, as its name suggests, is very much into conservation and ecology, although they are changing their standards and they're becoming more interested in things like farm output and welfare. So you can think of the Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade Foundation as similar but different. So they do slightly different things, but they are both well worth supporting. And Shane, your question about why we're eating higher cocoa solids chocolate, it's a really interesting one. We see this in other areas. I mean, if you think about Indian food, when I grew up, Indian food was the best at instant curry. And then people discovered freshly cooked curries. And then they discovered regional cuisines. So they discovered that curries in one part of India were very different to another part of curry, and they had preferences. We've seen the same thing in wine, where you used to be offered, white wine, then you got offered white wine or red wine, then you got offered German wine or French wine, and then you got Alsace or Bordeaux. So there does seem to be a journey that most people go on where they become more interested in where their food and drink comes from and the influence that has on the eating and drinking quality of it. Allied to which, there is a lot of interest amongst a lot of consumers in monitoring and reducing their sugar intake. And of course, the best way of reducing your sugar intake is to eat high cocoa solids chocolate. And the final thing to say is the brilliant thing about high cocoa solids chocolate is it uses more cocoa. So the farmers sell more cocoa, so they make more money. So really, higher cocoa solids chocolate, it's win-win.
Win-win for everyone. Lucille's asking, we see more raw chocolate on the market now. How's raw chocolate made?
So that's a really good question. And I have asked a number of raw chocolate manufacturers about how they make them. The idea is that by not roasting the cocoa beans, you preserve naturally occurring enzymes and nutrients in the cocoa beans. And so nutritionally, they're better for you. There's a lot of dispute as to what temperature you should keep them below. I've seen 49 degrees mentioned as the temperature you need to be below. The flaw in this argument is I mentioned that you have to ferment cocoa beans. In the middle of the heap of fermenting cocoa beans, you regularly get to temperatures of 55 and 60 degrees centigrade. So actually, the beans have got hot already. I personally am not a fan of raw cocoa, and that is because you saw how the beans were laid out in the sun to dry. That means they are vulnerable to anything that basically flies or crawls over them. So chocolate manufacturers have to be very careful about salmonella. And the way we deal with it in the factory is we roast our beans. What I don't know and what I've been unable to understand is if you don't roast your cocoa beans, how you deal with stuff like salmonella. Now, I'm not claiming for a minute that there are problems with all raw chocolate, because that's not something I would say. I don't know if it's true. What I am saying is I feel much happier that I eat chocolate that comes from beans that have been roasted, because I know that's sorted out salmonella and any other bugs that might be there.
Really fascinating. Another couple of questions. Could you tell us what ruby chocolate is? And then a separate question. When we mainstream chocolate like Galaxy, will it contain cocoa from lots of different countries and suppliers?
Okay, two good questions. Ruby chocolate is very interesting. It was developed by a company called Barry Callebaut and launched with a great fanfare probably a couple of years ago now. And what Barry Callebaut say is that it's a particular strain of cocoa beans, which when they process them are pink in color and have a naturally fruity flavor. And I actually saw one of the contestants on the Great British Bake Off during Biscuit Week using it in one of his biscuits, which I haven't seen before. So when you try ruby chocolate, it has a sort of slight sourness to it, but Barry Callebaut do add acid to it as well. So whether it would have that sourness without the acid, I don't know. I think there's a little bit of the Emperor's New Clothes about ruby chocolate. I remain unconvinced. My favorite chocolate is the brown stuff. What was the other question, Shane?
And in terms of kind of the more mainstream manufacturers, the larger manufacturers, are they sourcing
yes,
multiple countries?
You saw on the origin chart I put up that Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, between them, produce about 60% of the world's cocoa. That is largely the cocoa that goes into things like Cadbury's and Galaxy. So those sort of bars are going to be made with beans from Africa. As to whereabouts and as to which producers have produced those beans, that's more difficult to answer because it's all done on an enormous scale. And unlike people like Fair Trade, who very carefully follow the beans back to producers, that's not really practicable at the scale at which the large manufacturers operate. So I'm sure, I think they could probably tell you which countries their cocoa came from. Maybe they can tell you which regions the beans came from, but I don't think they get much further than that. So, but usually, it's a slight generalization, but usually the mass products, the Galaxies and the Cadbury Dairy Milks of this world will be made with cocoa from Africa. And as I was saying earlier, that's the non-fine chocolate. It's perfectly good cocoa, but it's not the cocoa that's grown to have a distinctive flavor.
Right. Quite a meaty question. Could you explain the differences, the pros and cons of fair trade versus direct trade?
Fair trade versus direct trade. I think they're both really good. If you are a small producer and you have a close direct relationship with your cocoa farmers, that is fantastic. I know small producers who buy their cocoa from the same farms. They actually go out and visit the farms, buy the same farmers year in, year out. They know the farms, they know the quality. And I mean, I think that is great. They'll always pay a fair price. And I think that's a great place to be. The problem is that only really works on a small scale when you have those personal relationships. For larger companies, if they want to do something more to support farmers than just pay the world cocoa price, that's where things like fair trade come in. It allows large manufacturers to make sure they're doing the right thing.
Great. Ronnie has said, is there any reason you've not mentioned salt in chocolate? They are particularly keen on salt. And what's your position on salt and chocolate?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of salt in chocolate. Some of my favorite chocolates have very discernible salt crystals, so you actually get a crunch to them. And salt is very useful in chocolate because it acts as a flavor enhancer. We've done a very nice white chocolate with salt in it. Works really well. So yeah, I'm a big fan of adding salt to chocolate. I realise that Public Health England and their salt reduction policy won't thank me for saying so, but you know, unless you're actually living on chocolate, I think it's unlikely to do too many bad things to your salt intake.
Really interesting question. Are there any other factors that can affect the taste of chocolate, such as lunar cycles or differences in fermentation?
I missed the last part of the question, such as
Lunar cycles, cycles of the moon.
Oh yes.
Or I guess I'm trying to think what the practice is called now off the top of my head, but you know what I'm talking about, or fermentation practices.
Yes. Chocolate, one of the reasons chocolate is so fascinating is there are so many ways you can get it wrong. It's very easy to make bad chocolate out of good cocoa beans. It's impossible to make good chocolate out of bad cocoa beans, but it's easy to make bad chocolate out of good cocoa beans. You can screw it up at any stage. You can screw it up when you harvest the beans, when you ferment the beans, when you dry the beans, when you roast the beans, when you grind the beans. It's a very complicated process, and you have to get every step right before it works. Every step has an influence on the finished product. The fermentation is completely crucial. Roasting is very important. Conching is very important. In terms of phases of the moon, that is such a good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, biodynamic production, which utilizes the phases of the moon, clearly has a huge influence on wine. I imagine it would have a huge influence on chocolate, but you see very little biodynamic chocolate around. So I think more research is probably needed in that area, and I'd be very happy to do it.
Absolutely fantastic. I guess a question for me, what is your own favourite chocolate? Not necessarily brand, but
I am a fan of these high cocoa solids milks, the dark milks, and our factory makes a 49% cocoa solids milk with sea salt, and that is my desert island chocolate.
Yes, actually, someone else has actually had almost the same question as that I've just asked you, and they said, which of the 5 that we've just tasted?
Yeah, probably the 55%, the Peruvian, the dark milk. Hotel Chocolat were very clever. They were the first people to really publicize this with their super milk range, which is 60% cocoa from memory. It's a very sensible thing to do. The other thing that I think will be important going forward is we need to provide people with alternative, with creamy chocolate that doesn't use milk. So, you know, there's increasing numbers of people who are trying to avoid dairy products, vegans, people who like having plant-based foods. So there's lots of interest in so-called nut milk chocolate, where you replace the dairy content with nut paste. I mentioned earlier, Gianduja in Italy does this as a traditional product, but we're seeing more and more. The Galaxy vegan range is very interesting. It's quite expensive, but they've replaced the milk with hazelnut paste, and it produces a really nice creamy eat. So I think we'll see more of those sort of products going forward.
Because most of the world, of course, is lactose intolerant. Northern Europeans generally aren't, but most
are absolutely.
So that's really interesting for exports. I've got one more question here, and there's probably time for another additional question if anyone wants to ask one. You've mentioned that the cocoa is grown in small family farms, and it's very labor intensive. With many younger generations now leading farms, what's that going to do for chocolate in the future? Young people that want to farm.
Yes, this is a real challenge facing the chocolate industry. The answer has to be to increase farmer income. It's why I work with the Fair Trade Foundation, because they are the only organisation that specifies a minimum price to farmers for their cocoa and then provides a premium on top. Growing cocoa has to be profitable. Otherwise, farmers will not encourage their children to follow them. And as the questioner says, they will leave the farms and go and do something else, or they'll grow a different crop. They'll grow rubber or spices or something. So farm income is the key. We have to pay more. It basically means we have to pay more for our chocolate. I am of the opinion that chocolate is one of life's great pleasures, and it shouldn't be consumed in enormous quantity at very low prices. The bars we've been trying today, they're £1.45 for 100 grams, which for a high quality product is not a lot of money. And I really do think it's very important going forward that as consumers, we make sure that we're buying chocolate with a good nice high cocoa content, and where the farmers have had a decent amount of money for their cocoa. So that will then encourage them to carry on growing cocoa and not do something else. Because basically, if people stop growing cocoa, we haven't got any chocolate.
And the last question is a wonderful question. I wish I thought of it myself, but this is from Lucille. And she says, can we talk of special years for chocolate in the same way we can for wine, like a special cuvee? So maybe the one year the chocolate particularly fun.
That is a brilliant question. I think you probably could, but at the moment, I don't think we have the necessary, I don't think we have the product stored to allow us to analyze it. One of the disadvantages of chocolate over wine is you actually have to eat chocolate quite quickly. I mean, I wouldn't want to leave a milk chocolate for longer than about 15 months, or a dark chocolate longer than about 18 months. So we can't really create vintages in the way that you can with wine. But because cocoa is a natural product and every year is slightly different, undoubtedly some years are going to be better than others. But I think this is another area where more research would be very useful.
Absolutely fascinating. Simon, on behalf of Slow Food and on behalf of everyone watching you, though you can't see them, I know because I've been there watching them with them, what an incredible presentation this has been.
Thank you.
I've been tasting, I still have half a kilo of chocolates. We will be eating chocolate sandwiches, I think, for the rest of the week.
Fantastic.
Problem to have. The rest of the Terra Madre Fringe is taking place until the end of the day on Monday. We have another 24 events taking place. A little later today, we've got a honey tasting with the world's leading expert on honey. We also have Tracy Worcester speaking. We have Patrick Holland speaking. And across the rest of the week, we have got people doing cheese tastings, cider tastings, and speaking about the ethics of food. So whatever your interest in food, do have a look at terramadrefringe.com. You know where that is. You've got your tickets today from there, and see if there's something else that you would like there. On behalf of everyone here, thank you very much, but particular thanks to Simon, who's given his time today. It's really wonderful, and I've learned so much. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Simon. It was really wonderful.
Great. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers.